exciting. We've done them with Michelle Bachelet, Ricardo Lagos, Joaquin Cardenas, and many other people. I've been in all of them, and they are, speaking just for myself, sometimes an exceptional experience. When you're sitting in the room with Ricardo Lagos, and he tells you firsthand, okay, so the generals had this lunch 2 weeks into my presidency, and I found out about it. And this is what I can. And you can ask and challenge and criticize and contribute ideas. So I encourage you. Any other questions about this? Then one final thing before we get into the final lecture for today, and that is the one paragraph to one page we've asked you to do on Botero, on the 4 paintings that are hanging in the law school. If you haven't done that, please do it and email it to your GSI. I am reading them as we speak. I mentioned we're going to send 5 or 10 of them to Mr. Botero. He made comment on them. He will certainly read them. The ones I have read so far are very, very good. We're not asking for something. There's not a hidden meaning you're meant to uncover. It's just meant for you to state your reactions to the art, to the paintings. It can be very personal. It can relate to the course, whatever you choose to do. Art, I hope, has been an important part of what we've sought to do in the course over this semester. So I'm going to read you a few sentences from one of them. There are many, many others I could have read here today. I have to say, I know these paintings very well. I will never forget when they arrived in Berkeley at the art warehouse where they had been shipped. And we went as the crate came off the truck. And we were there as they were taken out of the box, out of the crates. It was haunting. I had actually never seen the paintings in person. And when the first one came out, it was stunning. Just the richness and depth. In a way, you miss a little bit of that at the law school because they're protected, given the insurance requirements and the value of the art. But some of what you have done in your own personal reactions have opened my eyes and compelled me to look at the paintings in a different way. What do I mean by that? I'm going to read you a few sentences of just one. After viewing the 4 paintings of the Abu Ghraib series by Fernando Botero at Holt Hall, it left me wondering about my role in society. At first, I looked at Abu Ghraib 57 and 59. These 2 paintings had prison bars, which separated the viewer from what was happening. This made me feel like I was just a spectator of torture, a bystander of the dehumanized prisoner. However, when I looked at Abu Ghraib 60 and 45, the prison bars were no longer there, separating the viewer from the torture. Therefore, I was no longer a bystander. The painting placed me in the room where the torture was occurring, which made me ask myself, would I stop the torture or let it happen? I think that's a pretty profound insight. It's certainly something that never had occurred to me. I'm not asking for those who haven't done it for profound insights. Just give your reaction. You may want to look at that reaction in a year or in mentioned our goal in this was every year the memory will be more distant. And every year will be more important in a way to understand what took place and why. If it was necessary, let's remember. And if it was appalling, let's never let it happen again. And the art gives us that opportunity. Any questions on this? We're going to very briefly do two things today. One is a brief overview of some of the themes that have run through the course. And then I'm going to seek to answer for you briefly what a number of you have asked me in the last several weeks in office hours and when I've run into one or two of you, perhaps a few more in other settings, how I got interested in Latin America. And I will tell you a little bit about how I got interested and why. But let's begin what seems both to me like last week and was absolutely at the beginning of the semester. We began with the historical context, focusing on the Spanish conquest and what became Mexico. And the hope was that this would provide a historical point of reference for what we would do throughout the course. We couldn't, because of time and resources, do this for each of the countries. Each of the countries of Latin America are very different. There isn't a typical country, nor do we feel we have looked at 5 countries that will give you an understanding of the region. But we've looked at 5 countries, and you can compare and contrast, and the historical dimension is such a critical part of that. The conquest, the Mexican War of Independence, the Mexican-American War, which defined the southern border with Mexico, 30 years of dictatorship under Porfirio Diaz, where a pattern repeats itself of dictators who come in as reformers, who become increasingly ruthless, out of touch, and regimes that ultimately implode. The Mexican Revolution, a defining social revolution of the 20th century. Emiliano Zapata, one of the heroes of that revolution, pictured here. And finally, Lázaro Cárdenas signing the land reform, where some historians, where I would agree with this analysis, point to the culmination of the Mexican Revolution in the 6-year presidency of Cárdenas. But we went well beyond just looking at Mexico. Guatemala, Cuba, Chile, and Haiti were also covered. For Guatemala, this is a country where so much has happened, where there was such unspeakable brutality. Ultimately, as you know, a dictator, Rios Montt, was convicted by a Guatemalan court of genocide. That is the intent to wipe out a class of people by ethnicity, by race, by some unifying factor. It is a heinous crime against humanity. But sometimes we may speak about certain themes and they don't get the full treatment or emphasis they surely deserve. That is always the case. And for myself, or for Professor Mons, she, as you know, originated this course. She hopefully will be co-teaching it again. She was on sabbatical this semester. There are themes that were particularly critical this year that I think didn't get the proper emphasis. Let me mention two of them. One, and both were discussed, but let me tease it out right now in this summary. Social movements and the role they play in change. For the 5 Mexican earthquakes, social movements were involved, students, community groups in 1968, in that of people, in 1985, in the response to the earthquake, in 1988, in terms of the election in which Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas may have won that election as president of Mexico. So social movements run through all these themes. Chile, to be certain, the no vote that we looked at, that was a social movement. In Guatemala today, the president, vice president, head of the central bank, and some of their companions are all sitting in jail cells because of social movements. In Haiti, social movements have played a critical role. The second thing that didn't get the emphasis it deserved, in part because something has to come out to put something new in, but this will go in the fall, is climate change. The meetings, COP21, that are happening in Paris right now. California is viewed as one of the leading actors in the world in this. Our governor, Jerry Brown, is leaving today for Paris and will be giving an important set of talks at the climate change meetings next week. Actually, starting Friday, very likely, of this week. So you've got all of that taking place. And there are certain themes that run through the course. For example, how did the Cold War affect all 5 of these countries? How is immigration policy of the U.S. very different, say, between Haiti, Guatemala, Cuba, and perhaps other countries in Central America? These are 5 of the themes that we looked at. Security, the global economy, largely through NAFTA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, immigration, education, and human rights. Education was far more than the lecture specifically devoted to it. It runs through much else of what we've discussed. For Sergio Fajardo, the title of his special seminar is Education as a Method of Social Transformation. And it plays a role far beyond the classroom, far beyond the school, both of which are critical throughout Latin America. And of course, human rights runs through everything. We had 4 guest lecturers, and I thought that they brought some very special qualities, hopefully. John Perez, the former Speaker of the Assembly, can give a sense of what it's like to really affect change in California. Cárdenas speaks, his historical role is unique. Claudia Bernardi, a very fine artist in her own right, and the murals of the undocumented and unaccompanied children. We will be showing those murals on campus this spring, so you'll get a chance to see them. And of course, the extraordinary work that Carmelita Reyes does at the International School, a public high school in Oakland, all of whom students are refugees from around the world. where some of you volunteer there. It is a pretty extraordinary place to work. We've had a focus running through the course on art and music. We are trying for the future to integrate literature in a fuller way, as well as poetry. There are various ways of understanding, and art and music, literature, poetry, and other social or humanities related areas are ways of seeing and understanding. They don't diminish or detract from the rigor of what one does, in my view, but they often give us a deeper, fuller understanding. And I think that's important. This is a Diego Rivera mural. It's actually a portable mural that was shown in one of the first retrospectives by a living artist at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in the early 1930s. This is his understanding of the Depression, the dynamism of Manhattan above, people unemployed, sleeping in a warehouse, and a vault below. It's a different way of seeing. This is something that is coming in San Francisco. The Mexican Museum, which is, the Mexican Museum exists today. I mentioned it in lecture, but I'll briefly touch on it. They're breaking ground in the next several months. It will be 4 stories high in the heart of Yerba Buena, and it will have 60,000 feet of exhibit space, about the size of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art before the expansion. It will have a large auditorium for performance, lectures, and working rooms there. It should be a vital cultural addition to the Bay Area. Its title will be the Museum of Mexican and Latin American Arts. One of the opening exhibits will be Fernando Botero. Completely coincidentally, I'm chair of the International Advisory Board. So, any questions on this? Then very quickly, let me touch on how I became interested in Latin America. Some of you may know the journal, the Latin America Research Review, the scholarly journal put out by the Latin America Studies Association, LASA. I was sitting in the library reading articles, scholarly articles about Latin America, and I said to myself, this would be an interesting place to study. Any questions? Was there a question there? That pretty much covers it, right? Actually, that may not be the whole story. Though that could happen, I suppose, it's certainly not what happened to me. I think in retrospect, pursued a very unconventional route to becoming interested in Latin America. My goal was never, certainly at the beginning, because I wanted to pursue it in a scholarly way. But the lesson that you might draw out of it is not that this is what I would remotely recommend for anyone to do, but rather that sometimes your path follows a very unpredictable course that can result in some very profound and beneficial changes. So, Let me briefly discuss this. This is actually, Professor Mons, as I mentioned, originated this course and is co-taught it while it's existed. She comes from a very remote region in the Andes in southern Chile, near the border with Argentina. This is literally the area she grew up on a small, isolated farm in the Andes. Her family first got electricity when she was 16. There were no paved roads in this area. It was very remote, but spectacularly beautiful. This is another shot at it. This is where I grew up. This is the Ford Rouge plant in Detroit. I was born and raised in Detroit and still have very deep feelings and connections about this city. It's actually, I mentioned this the first day of the class, if you look at it on the map, Canada, due to an accident of geography where Detroit is on the border with Canada, Canada is south of Detroit. So in that sense, I grew up on the southern border, though not the one we would largely study in this course. This is another factory in Detroit. This is Cadillac. The car, this is where the Cadillacs used to be made. This was a sprawling complex right in the city that at peak employed about 20 or 30,000 workers. This is where I began, really, my work life at Cadillac, which was not, at General Motors, which was not such an unusual choice if you grew up in Detroit in those years. We look at Diego Rivera and the extraordinary Detroit murals, getting, I think, hopefully some important insights about what people do in factories and in manufacturing. This is my first professional qualification. I served an apprenticeship at General Motors to be a machine repair machinist. That's 4 hours of working in a factory, 800 hours of school at night, and I got a journeyman's card as a machine repair machinist. That's somebody who repairs the equipment in a factory. If we could go back to Diego Rivera. These are the machines in an engine plant. That's what you're seeing here, among others, that I used to work on repairing. Detroit is an extraordinary city. I think we're all in a way shaped by places we grow up, where we like them, or feel passionately about them, to be sure, where we dislike them in the same way. And I'm aware that an important part of my ideas and vision and values comes out of what I consider a truly extraordinary city then and as extraordinary today. But when I was, after working for about 10 years as a machinist in Detroit, mostly in car factories, in some other factories as well, building other kinds of machinery, I decided that I wanted to leave Detroit. I'd never been really out of the United States, not really, I'd never been out of the United States other than Canada. And I decided to go to Latin America. Why? Because I had never been. But one thing sparked it. Coming home after a long day on a Saturday, working in a machine shop. For a machinist in Detroit in those years, you either worked a huge amount of overtime, 70 or 80 hours a week, or you didn't work. So you really seized the moment. I stopped in a movie theater on a Saturday night. I can't remember what I went to see, but I remember a short before the movie. And the short was Sentinels of Silence, narrated by Orson Welles. What was it about? The historical ruins of Mexico. So some of you may have felt a little uncertain when you first took the course because you didn't know much about Mexico or Latin America. Whatever you knew more than I did. I wasn't aware there were ruins in Mexico. So I saw this movie, which actually, the short, it's about 20 minutes. We have it in Media Resources. And I said, whoa, I'd like to see that. I'd like to go there. And I said, I have a journeyman's card. I'd like to go further. I'd like to go to Chile. I'd like to work in Chile. So I took off, but I was aware that I spoke no Spanish and I knew nothing about the region. And I found out that in a place called Cuernavaca, about 60 kilometers south of Mexico City, there was an intensive language school where you could learn to be fluent in Spanish in 3 months. That sounded great. Professor Mon says I should never mention that because it will give CDOC a bad name. But I went there to learn Spanish. It's an immersion course. That was my first exposure to Latin America. I was on my way to South America to work, and CDOC was actually very different than what I imagined. It wasn't just a language school. There were hundreds of people there studying Spanish at all levels, 5 or 6 hours a day. It was also what bit difficult to describe what might be called a free university. They had classes there that anybody could take, and they were usually in 6-week blocks, and people came from all over the world to take the classes, and the people that taught them, unbeknownst to me, this was not the world I came out of, were some of the foremost intellectuals and scholars anywhere. So this is what CDOC looked like. It was an old mansion in a hill in Cuernavaca, and the classes were in these buildings surrounding this pool, which was not in use. To give you a sense of this, most of you are not going to recognize these names, but at the time, they were all very, very well known. This is Ivan Illich, the person who founded and ran the school, who himself is an extraordinary, was an extraordinary intellectual. He had been the vice rector, that's like our executive vice chancellor or provost, the number 2 person at the University of Puerto Rico. He was immersed in education at many different levels. He had also been, for quite a number of years, a parish priest in New York, in Spanish Harlem. He was Austrian by birth. He lived in Mexico. He was, when he ran CDOC, when he founded it and ran it, a priest and a Monsignor. So he was a very unusual person, and some of the books he wrote define this whole period. This you probably can't see. It shows some of the people that were there and shows the intellectual links. It's far from perfect. How many have heard of Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator? His most famous book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he was there. He was a good friend of Illich's. How many have heard of Erich Fromm, the social psychologist? Not too many. In a certain period, he was very well known. He was there. How about Paul Goodman? Growing Up Absurd. He was there. Someone you probably haven't heard of, a great film director of a previous period, Roberto Rossellini from Italy. He was there. One person who's not listed here, this is tracing the intellectual roots largely to publications, was Jerry Brown, who was close with Illich. And miraculously, I briefly appeared here. Now, after being in Mexico, I was going by bus. I wound up staying a year in Mexico, really reading and learning and meeting some very extraordinary people in Mexico. And then I continued by bus on my way to the show. I got lost in the highlands of Guatemala and wound up in an obscure small town, and I met a graduate student who was studying at the University of New York, who was Chilean, who was running the school. That proved to be an important encounter, but not quite as smooth as it might have been. This is a photo of me in the yellow sweater, shortly after having gotten arrested. And here we are at this small airstrip in the Highlands, and the woman whom I had met had flown into the jungle, into a small village called Santa Maria Ceja. And the pilot flew back. That was the only way to get there at this point. And he didn't fly directly in. It was a bit of a mess to get there. So the pilot had come back with her in the plane. I had gone out to the airport to meet her, and we had all gotten arrested. Why? What were you doing going into the jungle? That's all you needed. So this woman, before the soldiers take us away, says, you know, this is a bit of a misunderstanding, but let me photograph you. You know, you're a very impressive unit. You over here, you over there, and she starts bossing these people around until everybody lines up and take this photograph. And by the time we had gotten done with the photographs, they had said, let's forget it. Okay, you're out of here. Just get out of here. It had a happy ending that moment. It is wound up in the book you read. The pilot, Zach Manning, came from a religious group in the U.S. that had funded this aircraft. He was a volunteer. The guy standing in front of the plane, Fabian Perez, was the leader of the cooperative here in this town who was working with the village. 18 months later, he was dead. Machine gun, one of the early murders. Why? He was leading a cooperative. Literally, that was enough. This is that woman in a field with two Mayan women from the area. She was doing also literally field work here, but had gotten very close with the women, certainly in Santa Maria Zaha, but also here. This is Emiliano Zapata. How did this get mixed up here? I can tell you what he was thinking. I remember this distinctly. How am I going to get off this horse? This is me with the young graduate student I have met. She may look familiar. This is me after I had gotten talked into going to the village. And at this time it involved flying in to an airstrip and a military base, hiking out of the military base to a river, taking a dugout motorized canoe for a couple hours down the river, and then hiking into the village. But we took a different route out, which you had to cross. This is a bridge over. There's about a 20 or 30 foot drop into the river over this. This is as far as I got. Because I had decided, I think, maybe if I just crawled back to the village, that would be better than walking across this. But I did make it across and became, with Professor Montz, very involved in what the village was doing. Actually, let's go back to that one. That was the beginning of a deep appreciation, understanding, curiosity, and engagement with Latin America. The coup in Chile prevented either of us from going to what was my destination and where she had planned to go when she finished graduate school. So that didn't happen, at least then. This is me actually a couple months ago. This gets off the, this was a bicyclist, and this was bicycling from the West Coast to Boulder, Colorado, and this is in the Rockies on Trail Ridge Road. Any questions about this brief journey? The point I'd like to make out of it, that is why sometimes it's so important when you wind up in a different place and in a very different area. That engagement on the ground, was I there to write, study, understand? I was not. But to be there, there was a passion to doing it and an importance, and people that you met, and rather extraordinary people who reached out to you. For me, some of the people in the village, but also someone like Yvonne Illich, the person who ran the school, had a profound effect. And I think for all of us, who our mentors were and how we learned becomes profoundly important. And for me, it was that set of experiences that led me in a rather circuitous route to where I am teaching this course today. My first academic appointment was as a postdoctoral fellow at MIT. And what I worked on at MIT very much was issues of labor, work, and globalization coming out of my background from Detroit. From MIT, I went to the University of California in San Diego, where I taught for a number of years as a professor. And there, being on the southern border, I began understanding the relationship of work, labor, globalization, and specifically Latin America, and these two passionate interests came together. Any questions on that? Yes?
I'm curious to know, you worked for 10 years in a factory.
Yes.
When did you start college? Because I know that a lot of people in this room, they currently hold jobs.
Sure.
And things like that. So I'm just curious, did you go to college before that, or you college at while you were working after?
I had a a brief, spectacularly undistinguished college experience right after high school at the University of Chicago. And then I went back to Detroit, and I worked. And then finally I said, you know, it's hard work in a factory. I said, you know, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to serve an apprenticeship. That's actually very hard work. We refer to it as working with your hands. It's not working with your hands. It's physically demanding. But it is, I have the greatest respect for the people who do it. They work with their mind and their hands. So that is where I began. And when I went to Latin America, I had I had maybe a year of college. And I had no plans to go back. I had served an apprenticeship, and that's what I thought I would do. Until I met Professor Montz, and she thought that I should go back. And I went back in Detroit to Wayne State University while I was working during the day. So it gives you a certain perspective. And that's very much part of who I am. Yes?
This is perhaps a bit off topic as you're from Detroit. I was wondering what your thoughts feelings were on the kind of economic and social degradation that Detroit has experienced in the last few years.
I have very strong feelings on the economic and social issues of Detroit. I've been very involved in that. I'm actually planning on teaching a course on it in the fall. So I won't have time to go into it now, other than to say I feel very, very strongly about it. In fact, it almost caused me to leave UC Berkeley several years ago, when I received, for me personally, an extraordinary honor and offer where I was being asked to consider to go back to Wayne State University, which I felt that would be about the only thing that would have tempted me or would tempt me, and I was asked to go back as president. So for personal reasons I chose not to, but it was an honor. Yes?
This is very curious to know what your advice would be for us to continue educating ourselves in these topics and in the southern border. It seems like you're very educated in this area, of course, but what would be your advice for us?
Very quickly, the advice would be pursue what you think is important. Follow your ideas, values, not because it's a career move or not because this is what I need to do. There's something at the end of the day that's more important than that. You can actually do both. It's what you put in terms of your preference. So that's the advice that I would give. There's one other thing I'd like to show before we conclude for today, and that's to give you another sense of me. To hear some things that will be familiar, but to see it in a different context. I think it's very important if you have the privilege of being a professor, anything, but the privilege of being a professor, and for me, speaking very personally, in all the years I've been a professor here, I've never forgotten that it's a privilege because of Berkeley as a great institution and because of Berkeley as a public institution. That means you give back. To me, that is not antithetical, that is not opposed to your scholarly work, it strengthens it. If your ideas are out there, not simply for other scholars, but for other people more generally. So I often speak to public groups, I often work with political leaders, but I never turn down an opportunity when I'm asked to speak to workers. So I would I'm going to show you a brief talk I gave 5 years ago, where I was asked to give a talk at the United Auto Workers Convention in Detroit. And I was asked by the incoming president of the union, a man named Bob King, who was an extraordinary labor leader. He asked me to speak on the last day of the convention. So I said, what should I speak about? He said, you can speak about the economy. I said, okay, I can do that. How long? 5 minutes. Okay. There were 2 things he neglected to tell me that I found out just before the talk. First, he was going to lead, to begin his presidency, he was going to lead 2,000 delegates and 1,500 alternates out of the convention hall of downtown Detroit to a rally in front of a large bank to show, under his leadership, this was a social movement he was leading. And the speakers